Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Wild with me, Sarah Wilson. Today, I want to cover something, I guess, pretty topical. You've probably noticed that things out there are getting pretty wobbly. And as I record this episode with my guest today, the world is teetering on the edge of a catastrophic world war and fascism and AI takeover and all the rest. And I'm looking around and I'm seeing many everyday humans really feeling the precarity of this, the existential precarity. And I'm personally asked daily, so are we going to die? Is this what all of this is now going to amount to? Now, of course, biologists have argued throughout the ages that we are the only species aware that we're going to die. And philosophers, particularly the existentialists, have then pointed to an absurdity. So on the one hand, we know we're going to die, but we also have to live in a ridiculous denial of this, of the fact that we're going to die, to cope with the overwhelm and to get on with our lives. Now, this was all philosophical theory until today's guest, Dr. Sheldon Solomon, along with two colleagues, set out on a, almost 5-decade journey to put scientific clout to the idea and to show that our death denial practices, or what he calls terror management, so we're talking things like creating religions and moral laws and myths like the growth myth and consumerism and all the distractions that relieve us from the overwhelm of knowing we're going to die, are in fact what make up our complex civilization, such as the one we're currently living in. And they dictate how we all make our decisions, the decisions that create the culture. Or as he puts it, civilizations are immortality projects. I particularly like that line. But what happens as a civilization gets, wobbly and death becomes something that's increasingly in our face? And the denial dials up in the people around us, painfully so. Well, we'll come to all of that in this conversation. But I mostly asked Sheldon on here to talk us through the flip side of all of this. And that is where the terror management could be used to build the kind of myths and structures that can bring us together and take humanity to a wiser, less dangerously avoided and far more adult place. So, a more life-generating place, best prepared to build the what comes next, which, as you know, is the premise of this current exploration on Wild. So who is Sheldon Solomon? Some of you may have heard his name before. I certainly had in all of my kind of collapse work. He's an American social psychologist, a professor in psychology at Skidmore College in New York, and best known for developing this terror management theory that I just talked about, which he spells out in his two books. The first is called In the Wake of 9/11, and we talk sort of about 9/11 actually in the conversation, subtitled The Psychology of Terror, and the second book being The Worm at the Core, On the Role of Death in Life. He's an American Psychological Society fellow, and wait for this, he also invented the Doughboy. I don't know if you remember that, but it was a cult food stuff from a few years back, maybe decades ago. It's a dough thing filled with cheese and chicken and spices, which is its own flavour of absurd, right? Anyway, let's get to this very wonderful and nourishing conversation. Right, well, welcome to Wild, Sheldon Solomon. It's really wonderful to see you here.
Thank you, Sarah.
Now, look, I have a range of topics I want to cover with you today. And I've got a really big question that we're going to get to, but let's warm up to things by talking a bit of death, right? You argue that death, or rather our need to deny that we're all going to die, is actually at the core of the human experience, the human enterprise. Can you sort of explain that strange paradox? We know we're going to die, yet we live our lives denying it, and how that has come to define human civilization, where we are today.
Yes, a great question, Sarah. And that's really ideas that we got from a cultural anthropologist, Ernest Becker, who won a Pulitzer Prize, I think in 1973, for a book titled The Denial of Death, which when I stumbled upon it by accident in my first week as a professor in 1980, it really did change my life, both personally and professionally, because Becker just said, look, in many ways, we're like all living creatures. We are fundamentally motivated to survive. But there's a lot of different ways to do that. So you got the giraffes with the big necks and the eagles with the good eyesight and so on. And then Darwin was like, well, yeah, but wait a minute, what about people? Because we're kind of paradoxical. We're not real big. We're not real strong. We're not real fast. And yet, it's very magical because the way that we stay alive, according to Ernest Becker, is by virtue of our social proclivities, our capacity to cooperate and coordinate in conjunction with our amazing mind without getting too arrogant. Our ability to think abstractly and symbolically gives us the capacity to imagine things that don't even exist yet and then have the audacity to transform them into reality. So all other critters have to accept the world in the form in which they encounter it. Only humans, as far as we can tell, if they're dissatisfied with reality, can conjure up an image of an alternative version of it and make that happen. And I think to a large degree, that's why we've been so successful and inhabit so much of the earth. Now, one of the qualities of our amazing intelligence, according to Becker, is that we're not only alive, but we know that we're alive. You know, in psychobabble, they call it self-awareness or consciousness. And we take that for granted. You know, you wake up in the morning and you're like, oh, I woke up. Or you're walking to work and you're like, here I am walking to work. But a rose bush is alive and doesn't know it, and a raccoon's alive and doesn't know it. We're alive and we know it. And following philosophers, Becker just said, well, if you're smart enough to know you're alive, that's awesome and dreadful. It's great to be alive. And I hope that every one of us, when you wake up and you get a face full of fresh air, that you can just enjoy the spontaneous exuberance of life itself. All right, that's awesome. And we want to hold that point in our minds at the same time that we kind of spin around existentially 180 degrees and realize that if we're smart enough to know that we're here, we also realize that, like all living creatures, that we will someday not die, not only eventually, but perhaps at any moment for reasons that we can't anticipate or control. And then just to kick us in the existential groin, Becker, following Freud, says, okay, you're going to die. You might walk outside and get hit by a meteor, and you're an embodied animal. You're a breathing piece of defecating meat, and you're not any more significant or enduring than lizards or potatoes. And what Becker argued is that if that's all that we thought about, I'm going to die someday, I could die at any time, I'm just like a talking sausage, that we'd be literally overwhelmed with debilitating existential terror. And what he hypothesized is that we used our very intelligence to create a way to manage that existential terror through the construction and maintenance of what the anthropologists call culture, humanly constructed beliefs that we cooperate with our fellow citizens to create and maintain that serve to reduce death anxiety by giving us each a sense that life has meaning and we have value.
Right.
Right. And he says, look, all cultures, they give us an account of the origin of the universe. They tell us how we're supposed to behave while we're here. And they offer some hope of immortality, be it religious or symbolic. You might believe in heavens or afterlives, or maybe not, but you're just as preoccupied with the possibility that some vestige of yourself will persist over time nonetheless. Maybe you'll have kids. Maybe you'll do something and have a building named after you. But regardless, according to what we call terror management theory based on Becker's ideas, our fundamental motivation as human beings, whether we're aware of it or not, and mostly we're completely unaware of it, is to manage death anxiety by constantly maintaining confidence in our cultural worldview, as well as faith in our value as individuals, which he called self-esteem. And one more point, and that is that because we are motivated to have confidence in our beliefs and faith in our value, whenever those beliefs or our self-esteem is threatened, that automatically instigates defensive processes to restore psychological equanimity by enhancing our confidence in our belief system or inflating our sense of self-worth. And I think in a proverbial nutshell, that's what Becker was trying to argue, that we are creatures driven by a fundamental disinclination to die, whether we know it or not, in the form of a constant pursuit of a sense of meaning and value.
Yeah. And I think Becker was sort of quite unique in saying that that's actually what the definition, or that's what human culture looks like. It's basically looks like all the things we've done to kind of keep that self-esteem and that sense of meaning and purpose intact as we live out our lives as, people argue, the only species that's got an ongoing, awareness that it's going to die, right? I think,
That's right.
A cow, when they're right up against a threat, has an awareness it could die and will want to bolt or, ram whatever the threat is. But we live there with an expectation or an anticipation of it as a speculative thing. We know it could happen any time. We ruminate on it, and it's sort
Absolutely.
of the thing that defines us and distinguishes us.
Yes.
Yeah. So a lot of human culture and our mythologies and, for good and for bad, have developed out of our need to preserve humanity, from basically death by overwhelm, and to sort of ensure that we can kind of get on with lives and build structures and expand, etc., blah, blah, blah. It's sort of funny, though, what it does is it addresses the absurdity that the existentialists talked about, right? Camus and so on, right? We know we're going to die, and yet we continue to live. Like, why would we do that when we have this absolute fear of death? Well, we do it because we have these structures in place, right, that keep us sound. Now, all of this was sort of philosophy for a really long time, but you and your colleagues, right, having read Becker's work at university together, or college as you call it in the States, you decided to get together and find a way to, I guess, give some kind of scientific and psychological clout to it all. Could you give us a bit of a feel for some of the studies that you and your colleagues have been able to do that back up these claims and sort of show how so much of what we do, so much of what our culture is about, is a response to our death denial?
Yeah, again, great question, Sarah. And you put it accurately. I read Ernest Becker in 1980. I called up my buddies from grad school, Jeff Greenberg and Tom Pazinski, and I said, geez, this guy has really, in a haiku-like way, just said, this is why we do what we do. And we started talking at conferences in North America and Europe, and people were completely disinterested or dismayed because we talked to academic psychologists and they just said, that's just highly speculative. There's no evidence for this, and there's no way you could collect evidence for this. And so that's what we've been doing for the last 45 years. We did some studies, first of all, just to demonstrate that if self-esteem is elevated, that indeed buffers anxiety in general and about death in particular. But I think for our purposes, the studies that are most directly relevant are ones where it seems very simple, and in fact it is. We just did experiments where we remind some people that they're going to die, and we remind other people about something negative but not fatal. So sometimes in the lab, we ask people, just write down your thoughts and feelings about your own death. Or in a control condition, write down your thoughts and feelings if you were in a car accident and they had to cut off one of your legs. Or sometimes we stop people right in front of a funeral parlor or 100 meters to either side, thinking that if you're talking in front of a funeral parlor, death is going to be on your mind, whether you know it or not. Or we have other studies in the lab where people are reading things on a computer and we flash the word death for 28 milliseconds. It's so fast that you don't even see it. And what we thought is, well, Becker says that our beliefs about reality are to help us reduce death anxiety. And so what we thought is if we remind people that they're going to die, they should cling more tenaciously to their beliefs. And that means they should be more hateful and hostile towards anybody who has different beliefs and more loving and supportive of people who share their own beliefs. And so one of our first studies was with Christian participants in Arizona. We were reminded, some of them, that they were going to die, others of something unpleasant. And then we asked them to evaluate other students in their class who either identified as being Christian or Jewish. And we asked them to evaluate, what do you think about these folks? Are they smart? Would you like to be their friends? All right, the good news is in the control condition, the Christian participants rated all of the other students equally, whether they were Christian or Jewish, momentarily restoring my faith in humanity. On the other hand, if we reminded them of their mortality first, they then like Christians a lot more and Jewish people a lot less. Yeah. And this has nothing to do with Christianity per se. In Israel, Jewish people reminded of death, they like Jewish people more, and they dislike Arabs and Christians. And that basic effect has been reproduced in like 25 different countries on different continents. When death is on our mind, we dislike people that are different, and we like people that are similar. Not only about attitudes, though. When Germans are reminded that they're going to die, they sit closer to people who look German, further away from people that look like Turkish immigrants. Iranians reminded that they're going to die are more supportive of suicide bombing. And so our first line of research, we argue, gives us evidence that our inability to peacefully coexist with people who are different is at least in part as a result of efforts to manage death anxiety. Another line of research that we started in 2001, right after 9/11, when the World Trade Center was hit by the airplanes, as well as the Capitol in Washington, D.C. President George W. Bush, who had the lowest approval rating in American history the day before that, 3 weeks later, he had the highest approval rating. And following Ernest Becker, who said, in times of historical upheaval, we tend to become attached to charismatic leaders, seemingly larger than life individuals, who are often perceived as divinely ordained to rid the world of evil. So sure enough, we did studies where we showed that Americans didn't like George W. Bush in control conditions. They preferred John Kerry, who was running for president against him. But when we reminded them of death first, they like Bush more and Kerry less. Same thing in 2016, when Donald Trump announced that he was running for president. We did a study and we showed that Americans liked Hillary Clinton more than Donald Trump, except if they were reminded of death, in which case their affection for Trump increased. And so that's another line of inquiry, that existential anxieties make us cling to fascist demagogues, and something that we're seeing not only in my country, but around the world presently. All right, then we had another line of work where we demonstrated that when death is on our mind, we deny that we're animals. We're uncomfortable in nature. Another pile of studies showed that when death is on our mind, it exponentially increases our insatiable desire for money and stuff. We say we need more money to be rich. If we're asked to draw pictures of money, we draw them bigger as if money looms larger on our mind. And then a study that my buddy Tom did with some of his Polish colleagues that I find amazing, they just asked people to count money, not to keep it. They just gave them money to count. They gave other people pieces of paper, and then they measured death anxiety, and just having money in our hands reduced death anxiety. Two more things real quickly. Death also increases our hostility towards the environment, and for many people increases the disbelief in the incoming climate apocalypse. And then finally, death also just turns us into a petri dish of psychopathology. Whenever death is on our mind, it amplifies pre-existing psychological conditions. Phobics become more afraid. OCD people become more obsessed. Socially anxious people become more socially anxious. And it does sound kind of negative, because Ernest Becker was trying to point out how when we kind of bury death anxiety under the psychological bushes, it comes back to bear bitter fruit. In his last book, Escape from Evil, he just said, I wonder if we're a viable species. Another guy, Robert J. Lifton, I think it was Destroying the World to Save It, he just said, wow, we could be the first form of life to have the ignominious distinction of being responsible for our own extinction. And of course, that sure does sound negative. All right. On the other hand, though, to just kind of spin that in the other direction, human beings really have a good track record historically of extricating ourselves from terrible situations once we can collectively understand why it's happening. The example I like the most, because I think we can all understand it, is the plague in the Middle Ages. Half of the people in Europe were killed, and we thought it was because of evil spirits. But as long as that's what we thought, and we'd be like dipping people in boiling water or making them drink pus to just chase the evil spirits out, well, that didn't work. But then we figured out that it was bacteria. And that in turn led to the development of modern medicine, which is why many of us breathing today are still here. All right. And so by the same token, what I'd like to think is that Albert Camus is on the right track when he said, come to terms with death. Yep. Thereafter, anything is possible. And I would like to think that that's the case, even though right now we are certainly in a volatile world where we're collectively marinating in death anxiety, both conscious and unconscious, that Nietzsche, the philosopher, may have been right, which is, yes, sometimes the world is reduced to a smoldering heap, but that becomes the fertile compost from which we might be able to elevate ourselves in a transformative fashion. And I see a lot of your work but being related to that, cautiously optimistic, but I believe to be quite right, philosophically, psychologically, and empirically at this point.
Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you for looking at my work. I'm chuffed that you did your research as well. But I want to come back to that sort of more optimistic take on how terror management can be used by humans. But first of all, I mean, look, the thesis really does explain so much of culture, the fact that we've got ourselves enthralled by the growth myth and consumerism, the tribal nature of us, which can actually swing out in good ways and bad ways. It's essentially kept us alive, right?
Exactly.
And ticking along. But then we really kind of corrupt the hell out of it when we are not handling the looming threat of death. Now,
Yes.
what I
Sarah,
find...
if I can jump...
please do. Go ahead.
Yeah, just to jump in, because what you just said is really brilliant. And I want to be sure that the folks that are listening don't throw the proverbial baby out with the bathwater, because our collective composition of cultural narratives that infuse our lives with meaning and value at its best are why even our tribal inclinations, without them, we'd be dead. So we don't want to lose track of the virtues of the pursuit of meaning and value. Just to quote you, we just need to be aware of, cognizant of, and reactive to when those processes are corrupted. I think that's a great word.
Yeah, and I think that we can see that a lot of the systems and the myths and the structures that we've built as a result of our need to deny death so that we don't be overwhelmed by, the precarity of life at every given moment. We can get on with having, as you said, a joyful and awesome life, because, awesome and awe and terror, are sort of Kierkegaard, next to that. That is the paradox that we must carry as humans. We get to have these awesome experiences, and then we've got to carry the terror. So, how artfully we manage that balance is kind of an indicator of how well we survive as a civilization. And I suppose what it does is leads us to the current moment, where essentially we are being forced to face our potential extinction, at all kinds of levels. There's AI, there's the climate crisis, which we've been having to face for a very long time, the descent of fascism, the erosion of democracy, and now, as we're speaking here together on opposite sides of the world, a potential, world war, and a really, really hectically scary world war. So we're getting our death reminders. We don't need, Sheldon Solomon and his crew dropping in subliminal kind of, suggestions, right? It's the background buzz to life now. And so can you talk us through what that is doing, right? Because I suspect you have a really interesting lens for viewing what the hell is going on, because that is what everybody's waking up to, is like a response that says, what the hell is going on? Why is this all happening at once? Why are we reverting to our worst behaviors? How have we gone from operating in a fairly stable way at a global level, where things have kind of been ticking along? The myths have been holding us together. They've been keeping us from freaking out. But now we've turned into a culture that, invites, or I should say elects leaders like Trump, and allows ICE to enter its state. And that's sort of responding to environmental and climate collapse with consuming more and more, and reverting to fragmentation and more othering than we've ever seen in our lives.
Yes.
How does this happen through that sort of terror management lens? How do we come to this moment?
Yeah. Again, now, great question. I'm silly when I'm asked good questions. I always say, look, if I could answer that, I'd be chugging rum out of a coconut with our Nobel Prize on the beach, because I do think that is the important question. How do these ideas inform our understanding of what's happening around us? And I think they're necessary, but not sufficient. And what I mean by that is, there's a lot of things going on. And I'm preoccupied right now with work that's called cliodynamics. It's just the study of social processes. There's a scholar named Peter Turchin who wrote a book called End Times. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, he argues that we do live in cycles, and in modernity, in the last few hundred years, they're like every 80 years or so. And he argues that structurally, um, when when things are stable, it's because we're in a moment in time where there's not a yawning chasm between the rich and the poor, and that when the rich get richer, the poor also are better off. It turns out that poor people, as long as they have enough to eat, and they're doing well, when the rising tide lifts all boats, according to Turchin, that's when we're stable. All right. But on the other hand, when the rich people keep getting richer, but the little people do not, he also has a thing he calls elite overproduction. And that's where you have more and more rich people wanting to be president or CEOs. And but what happens, though, and he predicted a decade ago that the United States would collapse right around now.
Yeah.
It's not a political argument. It was just about income inequality.
It's
And
modeling.
he, yeah. And he says, look, people, he calls it immiseration, that people are not only economically distressed, but they're psychologically impaired. They actually get shorter, they're less tall, their lifespan decreases, they get angry or depressed. And it is at these times, according to Turchin, that there's a political fork in the road. Sometimes you might have, like before World War II in the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt comes along and he says, well, he worked with the rich people and said, well, I'd rather pay more taxes than be dead. And he started the New Deal and Social Security. And at least for white people, it was the best 40 or 50 years in the United States. All right, but it doesn't always go that way. Sometimes what happens is you get a fascist type who takes the fear and anger of the impoverished and literally becomes an alchemist of hate by just saying, only I can fix it. Let me tell you who it is that's the all-encompassing repositories. They're
And
evil.
rams up the fear of death in the community.
Exactly.
I mean,
there you go. And that is exactly the case. And so from this point of view, getting back to your original question, Sarah, is like, how do we understand what's happening right now? Well, I think it's a juxtaposition of structural factors that are primarily economic with psychodynamic ones, which is that when there's economic and political pressure, that's what arouses death anxiety. And so here we are in this really accelerating cycle.
A death cycle. Literally a death cycle.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. And it's, I mean, there's so many paradoxes, right, involved in everything you're talking about. And it sort of speaks to the complexity of the human mind and the human experience. And as you know, I look at things through a complexity lens, as does Turchin. But I think what you're speaking to fits in here because as you have sort of more factors, more systems that are dying, that are pointing to potential human death, then that kind of dials up all the death reminders, to use, I guess, the language that you use in your work, which then, you know, if you have leaders who capitalize on that stoke the fires of death anxiety, then all of those systems and their problems start to intensify and they all feed in on each other. And we find ourselves in this kind of strange, deathly race to the bottom. And so I find your terror management theory fits in so well with that because it's the death anxiety in some ways that stokes things. And my thesis in my work has been that the growth imperative in many ways is at the core of everything that's going on for our civilization because we basically anchored everything to the growth imperative, you know, including this idea of infinite fossil fuel energies on the planet, on a finite planet. And of course, the growth myth is one of the terror management techniques that our civilization has propped up. It's, this kind of myth that we've put in place to keep people feeling that sense of self-esteem, that sense of worth. Our entire ability to grow, or I should say, to stay together as a civilization has been built on that myth. And of course, it's coming undone. So I can see how it all sort of fits in. I want to ask a couple of, I guess, granular questions that came up for me before we move on to sort of how we might be able to use terror management to get us out of this. Because as you said, there's fork in the road moments, and I think we're at another one right now. So you've looked at all kinds of studies and you've played around with various variables. Have you found any difference in the way that maybe men or conservatives or any other kind of group respond to death reminders? Or is it fairly consistent across the board?
Yeah, again, really good question. There's considerable differences. For example, conservative people who identify as conservative, and I don't mean as an indictment of their character or intelligence. It is important to note that political orientation is largely heritable. If you have a set of twins and they're separated at birth, it's not 100%, but there's a strong heritability component, which suggests that there's something highly adaptive about being conservative as well as being liberal, and that it's not a question of who's right. I think it's terrifying that we're seeing this as like a contest of who's going to beat up who, rather than what would things be like if we made the best out of our differences. All right, but back to those differences. People that identify as conservative, they generally see themselves as superior to people who are different. The word liberal means tolerant and open-minded. And sure enough, we did a study where we reminded conservative participants of their death, and they liked liberal people even less than they normally did. Liberal people reminded that they were going to die. They became more friendly and encouraging. They like conservative people more. So that's
What's
just
that
one
about then? Is that about, so that what that makes me think, Sheldon, is that our responses to death reminders are very culturally triggered. So
yes.
if you've grown up with a belief that when things get scary, we've got to love each other, lots of love and light, then that's what you're going to revert to. So it's that tribal element, right? So if your tribal kind of baseline is that's what we revert to. That is super interesting.
Yeah, so this is one thing to think about. It is true. What happens in our studies is generally that death reminders amplify pre-existing tendencies. And what that suggests is that one direction for us to go in as a culture is to just think about the nature of our cultural worldviews. So some people point out that a lot of worldviews are rather hierarchical, where we proclaim ourselves superior to and in order to dominate everyone and everything. Others are more egalitarian. So rather than
education and cultural values has a huge part to play in this.
Yes, that's right.
Right. Okay. We're going to come back to that because this is feeding into sort of the big blockbuster question I'm going to be asking you here to sort of resolve for us. But that's sort of conservatives versus liberal. Is there anything else? Are there any other sort of distinguishing results that you've come across, say, between men and women, between people in different parts of the world? Anything else that gives us a picture of what we're talking about here, that the sort of the worldview that you come from, that is what is accentuate when you have a death reminder?
Yeah, well, sometimes it's about a function of worldview. Sometimes it's a function of personality attributes. So, for example, attachment theory, people that are securely attached when they're reminded of their mortality they become more connected to their significant others. Whereas people that are insecurely attached, when they're reminded of their mortality, they become more interested in killing folks who are different. And so we are all responsive to existential apprehensions, but yeah, in different ways, depending upon these predilections.
Okay. So there's a question that really burns for me as you've been talking about all of this. Why would we evolve this way? Why would we evolve to have something that can de-evolve the human experience so readily? Why would we evolve to be so triggered by a death reminder and often descend into our worst, most base behavior and be so vulnerable to our social conditions and whoever is the leader at the time? Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Why are we here,
Yeah, no, again, a really remarkable question. We are at a good point. Back to Ernest Becker, we're basically a species in diapers. We've not been around for very long. We're all descended, the evolutionary types tell us, from like a single, relatively tiny community in southeastern Africa. And it is just literally simply unclear why and how some would argue that we're still around. And this gets back to the Ernest Becker point, which is that we don't know, whether we're a viable species, because right now we sure seem to be in a situation where, as some people are noting, again, ironically, that we are so disinclined to die that we are
trying.
Quite exactly. I mean, even to the point, and this is probably not the right time for an extensive discussion, but a lot of the richest people in the world have the highest amount of death anxiety, along with the world leaders. But the rich people on Earth, they're spending a lot of time and money to just abandon the human body as well as to abandon humanity. They're like, yeah, I don't need a carcass. I'm going to upload myself on a cloud. And when the world melts, I'll just be Googling someplace, as if that is the basis for any kind of psychological equanimity. Yeah. I don't get it. It's like being a frozen burrito.
Pretty much. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? So death anxiety can cause us, you mentioned earlier, to become more fixated on money, right? And to value money more. And then it sort of almost feeds up the other way. The richer you are, the more death anxiety that you have.
Absolutely.
It seems to be, a two-way relationship, which is super, super interesting. So look, it does all sound a little like this horrible Moloch-y death spiral that we're all trapped in. But what you've really said a few times in the course of, 39 minutes that we've been talking, is that we can actually go the other way with the right stimuli, with the right leaders who can actually present, opportunities in a particular way. We can actually use our fear of death, to actually become more community orientated, to become kinder, to want to share more. And I guess the question that I've really asked you to join us for today to answer is, can we break the game at this fork in the road moment? Because, I think a lot of people are feeling that we are at a precarious juncture. At this juncture, Sheldon, do you feel that we could actually break this game?
Well, again, I hope so. Whether or not this is wishful thinking or a manifestation of my own death denial, I do think there's been glimpses, and I like how you framed it earlier, Sarah. At our best, we are heroic. We
Yeah.
are so uber social, so uber caring, and
And
it's
just on
like,
that point, just to
yeah,
add to that, um, what you mentioned before is that, in answer to my question, why have we evolved this way? And you've sort of said, I don't know, but it's almost like we're at this immature spot. And perhaps the evolutionary story is to evolve beyond it. Maybe it's as simple as that,
nice,
to into a
good.
maturity that actually, and I sort of say this quite often, can you imagine if we pull this off? Can you imagine if the human ache kind of gathers this beautiful momentum with the right kind of emergent leadership, and we step up into the best version of ourselves?
Nice.
Can you just imagine how epic that's going to be, how awesome that's going to be?
Yeah. So again, I love what you say. One of Freud's disciples, Geza Roheim, yeah, he just said it's time for humans to grow up. We are an immature species, and yet we have so much to rely on, because when we look cross culturally, historically, religiously, philosophically, and otherwise, and what we find is that throughout history, there is at our best. We've got
Mm.
awe, humility, gratitude, a sense of cosmic connection to the folks around us, not only the people around us, not only the plants and the animals around us, but the rocks and the wind. And we can, under those conditions, not forget about the fact that we're going to die, because that's also a denial of death. But recognize that, death is part of life, and that
Mm.
when that happens, uh, experimentally as well as experientially, the malignant manifestations of death anxiety disappear. So there's some
Yeah.
amazing studies that show that things like mindfulness, meditation, the recent studies in psychedelics, rituals, public festivals, even just momentary social interactions. You know how sometimes you pass somebody in the street and you just catch their eye and you look at each other like, I know that you know that we know, and you're never going to see them again. But there's studies that show that really not only brings out the best in us, but it does so by reducing defensive reactions to death reminders. And this is not only attitudinally and behaviorally, this is being demonstrated neuroanatomically, that when death is on our mind and we're behaving defensively, there's one pattern of neurological response, but that changes under those conditions. The problem right now, and I do see us in kind of a race of sorts, because there's a biological asymmetry. We're always more responsive to danger than we are to approaching things. And, that's why, fear and hate always tends to have an advantage over love and hope. But I think the Nietzsche dude was right when he said things may have to come pretty close to a smoldering heap before we can, as a species, step back and say we have to accept our common humanity, and we have to, partake of the reality of our surroundings, but to do so with this fundamental collective and cooperative and optimistic and exuberant effort to keep going.
Yeah, yeah. I know your work looks into sort of different ways that the death reminders can be used for good, to simplify things. One of them is to face death. I think the philosophers have been going on about this for years. Montaigne, for instance, says,
Yeah.
to live well, you've got to learn to die well. And, he advocated getting up really close to death, even digging your own grave, right? Like
Yeah.
really. And what he would say was, the more familiar we are with death, right, the more it takes the sting out of things. And so we can become less reactive
Yes.
to some of these problematic responses to our fear of death. But what are some other things and maybe I could phrase it this way, Sheldon, if you were able to put a blueprint together to the world leaders, right, and say, these are the kinds of things that you could all be doing to get us on the right track, to choose the right path at this juncture in the road. What are some things that you would encourage leaders to do? And of course, everybody listening here is a leader, because I think the future is not going to come from top down. It's going to be an emergent community-led thing. What are some of the things that you would advise that we can do right now? Because I actually think we're at that, 11th hour, Nietzsche's 11th hour. And I actually don't think we have a chance to, or an opportunity to step back. We're just going to have to step forward into this stuff because it's that much of an emergency.
Yeah.
So talk us through some of the things that we can start doing now. And I know you've put, a lot of work into showing that these can work.
Yeah. Well, back to Ernest Becker, because here he was in the 1970s thinking about these things. And he was like, well, first of all, and this gets back to the Peter Turchin thing, and that's that we ideally have to engineer cultural worldviews that provide for the physical and material needs of their constituents within the confines of their access to natural resources and technology. In simple English, it's to what extent are we providing for the people in our groups? And of course, in this sense, the answer is, well, it depends on who you ask. Some people say, well, in the last century, things have never been better. There's a lot fewer people in poverty. I don't share that view. I see things as, so that's one thing, is that we can't ignore the structural factors, and that any effort to stabilize our humanity, I think, will require explicit attention to the structural factors. And then Ernest Becker says, well, and then when we're in a state of psychological dis-ease, not disease, put a hyphen between dis and ease, we need to look at our cultural worldviews and just say, well, are we advocating, or do we socialize our children to embrace values that are not realistically attainable for the average individual? So Robert Sandel, a philosopher at Harvard, in a book called The Tyranny of Merit, he says, look, Americans are miserable because we teach our kids that if you're not the best at what you do, then you're a failure. So if you're the second...
It's almost like sort of provide different, I'm using your words here and Becker's words, provide a different immortality project.
Exactly.
The immortality project at the moment is growth, and
yes.
where that's landing us. So it's like leaders need to be providing a different immortality project for us all.
Nice. And there you go. And there's several that seem just trite, but that, again, experimentally appeared to be quite effective. So one's just, there's existential psychologists, they just call it experiential appreciation. They're like, look, some of us are like, oh, I need to be the richest person. I need to be the smartest. Whereas there's other people that are just enchanted and enthusiastically engaged with whatever it is that they happen to be doing. There's another, I think it's Oliver Berkman, talks about cosmic insignificance. I love that because instead of teaching our children to aspire for that which is unattainable or requires that we perceive ourselves as superior to others, why not emphasize what comes quite naturally to us, and that's to luxuriate in our present activities. And to realize that meaning and value are ultimately humanly defined. I like that we wrote a book and some people have read it. That's good, but I should be just as happy if I open the door for somebody that's walking out of a store and we get a little bit of a smile and so on. I think we've just, as trite as it sounds, perhaps, we have become impervious to just the day-to-day activities that will provide an extraordinary sense of meaning and value if we just take more seriously whatever it is that we happen to be doing.
Yeah. I think in your work, you talk about expanding our sense of identity and esteem beyond tribal worldviews.
Yes.
Another one that you talk about is pursuing symbolic immortality. So, my understanding of that is leaving legacy that goes, it's that idea of planting a tree that you'll never get to sit under, that kind of thing. And if we can promote those values once again, because it's not like it was that long ago that they were the values that we revered as a culture, then when we get those death reminders, we tend to choose a path, sort of a psychological path that goes in that direction rather than in the other direction. So it's about really leaders, if I can understand you correctly here, it's about leaders creating a different type of worldview and tribal kind of connectivity so that that's what we revert to when we're going to be bludgeoned with images and reminders of death in coming years and decades. Have I got things right there? And if so, could you just give some more examples of how that might look and maybe examples of how it's kind of played out in history successfully?
Yeah, so there's a lot of folks writing these days. Have you seen or heard of the book Braiding Sweetgrass?
Yes.
Yes. And Robin Kimmerer. So she writes about indigenous Native American societies. Who's David Graeber, The Dawn of Everything, with David Ross now. They write about, they're like, look, we've got to look beyond just the Western civilization, which tends to be extraordinarily patriarchal as well as hierarchical, and note that, and also that we're rather unique in our society because we're groping. We just see the inevitable need for progress in pursuit of infinite wealth, and that's an aberration, as we were alluding to earlier. There's only two things where infinite growth is good: compound interest and malignant tumors. Otherwise, for humanity, it's not about inevitable linear progress. It's more a circular accumulation of knowledge and wisdom over time, as that we pass through over generations. There's been a lot of, evidently, according to these folks, they tend to be matriarchal cultures that are based more on egalitarian approaches to life. And they do tend to emphasize things like awe and gratitude and humility, respect for nature, tolerance of others. And I think those are the kinds of directions that leaders would be best to drift towards.
Yeah. And it's interesting because just as death anxiety has created, particularly recently, a tendency towards separation, fragmentation, authoritarian leaders, fascism, and so on, which then creates more death anxiety, and down the spiral we go at an exponential rate, I should say. I would imagine that if we create, I guess, a sort of an atmosphere, if we normalize the hell out of more expansive, community-led, belonging type messages, then when we are faced with death, and what it does is produces more expansiveness, love, compassion, and awe, it's only going to accelerate and expand exponentially up the other way, if that makes sense. So I think this kind of thing can happen actually quite fast. And our mission, should we choose to accept it, is really to normalize the hell out of these kind of values in every action that we take part in from this point forward. I mean, it's not a bad mission, right?
No, not at all. And again, I like how you put it. It should pervade every activity. It shouldn't matter in principle.
With the knowledge that it's contagious, that it's spread, correct. And that it's going to actually activate something that grows exponentially. It's not going to be a plod along thing. So we could actually do this. And at the bare minimum, and I'm sort of jumping around a little bit in my own sort of thoughts and theses around this, but I think this is the space you're in too, is, you know, the juncture we're at is like that moment Milton Friedman talks about, you know, a change happens when there's a crisis, but the change comes about depending on the ideas that are lying around at the time. And like this big kind of stack up of structures and mythologies that no longer serve us, it's going down. And so really what we need to be thinking about is the ideas that are going to be left. And that's what we can be doing. We can be building the ideas that need to be lying around, and we can do it now, and they can be strong and kind of growing like a virus in a petri dish, you know, but in a good way.
Yeah.
Now, well, it's probably not a bad note to finish on, me paraphrasing your entire life's work there, Sheldon.
Well, thank you.
You know, and I really could listen to you forever because your anecdotes are just so colourful and wonderful, and I can see that you live and breathe this stuff. Before I ask my last final question, I'm just wondering, have you found, you know, as you said, you've been doing this work for 45 years, and I'm wondering, have you found that it has made you more compassionate to the human species? Do you find yourself, as you go deeper and deeper into this understanding, as you said, you know, the more that we understand things, the more we're able to sort of we've got the better chance of being more mature in our thinking. Are you finding that it's helping? Because a lot of people ask me a similar question, you know, if you're in this space all the time, contemplating both our best and our worst behaviours, does it get you despondent or does it actually make you more connected?
Probably both. To be honest, there are times where I realize that the 45 years of research has been a very effective way of dodging my own death anxiety by turning it into an intellectual exercise.
Yeah, which the intellectualism can actually keep you from actually facing what you're doing. It's very seductive. I get it.
Yes, it is. Yeah. And so what I'm hoping is that at least of late that I've been able to leverage these ideas in ways that I would like to think are nudging me in these directions. Where writing a paper and feeling good about that is, I like that. But as I said earlier, I'm now just as amazed on a lovely day, walking our dog, getting a face full of fresh air. I just, there's a book, do you know the book called An Inconvenient Apocalypse? Have you ever heard that title?
It rings a bell, but no, I don't know
it. I'm so senile that I can't remember names anymore, but the folks that write this...
Mine's perimenopause. We're on the same page, but I think we've done so well. 50
But in this book, these guys are like, well, you know, what kind of sounds... They're like, wow, the world's melting. And that part of it, they say, is because our species was designed to just live in like small communities, so like 150 or 200 people. And they're like, oh, well, what should we do in the future? And they're like, well, what did we do mostly in the old days? And they're like, well, in antiquity, you didn't work 12 hours a day when there was enough to eat. Basically, they said they called it milling around. They just like, well, on a good day, you just kind of milled around and mingled with your fellow humans. And that's been my preoccupation lately for the last couple of months. I just like walking around our town randomly.
Looking at
And I
other people's
find
faces.
exactly. And I
Mm.
find the so I'd like to think that that has made me more prone to accept the reality of my own transience than what
Yeah.
we've learned from these studies.
Interesting. Normalizing the hell out of milling around rather than being productive and in the growth imperative. That's a
Precisely.
that, that's a good aim. Um, the last question that I ask all my guests on this series of Wild is one that I think a lot of listeners are just needing inspiration on. How do you cope with, well, I guess with death, with your own denial, with the choices we're being presented with the whole clusterfuck of, where the world's at today? What are you doing, Sheldon, at an intimate level to be able to just cope and be in all of this? Something that you
Yeah.
might be able to share with everyone listening.
Again, to be repetitive, some of it's just my preoccupation with walking around. I am trying very much to, I know some of these things sound silly, but I find a lot of people in my immediate surroundings, they just look like they're in a dissociated stupor. I can never tell when I pass somebody on the street if they're psychotic or if they're yelling at their phone that's in their pocket. It's hard to make eye contact with some people. And so that's been part of my enterprise, is to just be aware of the little things, just
Yeah.
acknowledging my surroundings, again, people, plants, pets, and beyond. And again, I like how you put it earlier. I think we just have to step forward. And I don't know that there's one particular path, except as I thought I heard it from you, Sarah, which is to just infuse everything that we do with that sense of awe and gratitude and
Yeah.
humility. And I just think that that will ultimately bring out the best in all of us.
Yeah, be it and be it now.
Yeah.
I want to invite you to look up, if you're not familiar with their work already, there's an incredible poem by K. Tempest, Kae,
No.
Tempest, called Other People's Faces. And it's essentially about the turmoil. It was written quite a number of years ago now, but they go out into the world and just observe other people's faces, as a sort of a balm and a way of understanding what's going on and connecting with the pain and the ache that we all have. And it's a technique that I use as well. I say to people, when you're starting to fret, just get out of the house and start walking and just walk around amongst humanity. Just be in it, Hey, Sheldon, that was a wonderful conversation. I would love to be going for a walk with you around your neighbourhood and talking more about this. In the show notes and everything, I'll leave all details for people who want to follow your work. I know you're still working in this realm and developing more and more information and techniques for death awareness, which I think is your latest sort of area of work. I wish you so much luck and fortitude as you go about normalizing the hell out of better ways of being in the world. Thank you very much.
You too, Sarah. Have a great day.